Tonight on Reporting Scotland, a 19-year-old man is found guilty of causing the death of a woman in a crash on the A77 while he was racing another car. Her family say the verdict doesn't bring her back.
With 3 children, 3 grandchildren who under 7, who loved their nana, who are no longer able to give nana a cuddle.
Also on the programme, Scottish football in crisis. Stuart Regan resigns as chief executive of the SFA, while the national team is still without a manager. Controlling and coercive behaviour will now be treated as domestic abuse. MSPs pass a new law. Calls for alcohol to carry health warnings as figures show drinking was a factor in almost 4,000 deaths in a year. Cancer, the biggest single cause. And after disqualifications and death threats 4 years ago, speed skater Elise Christie is going for glory in Korea. Good evening. A 19-year-old man has been found guilty of causing the death of a woman in a car crash on the A77 in Ayrshire last January. John Gribben was involved in a race with another driver at speeds of up to 140 miles an hour. A second man, Logan Knox, is already serving a sentence after he admitted causing the death of 59-year-old Joan Price in a head-on collision. Aileen Clark has been speaking to Mrs Price's husband.
Joan Price was a much-loved wife, mother and grandmother.
Apart from myself, I say there's with 3 children, 3 grandchildren who under 7, who loved their nana, who are no longer able to give nana a cuddle. We've had to explain to them.
A year ago this week, on the A77 near Ayr, Joan Price was killed as she drove home. 20-year-old Logan Knox was driving the car that hit her. He was disqualified from driving at the time. He claimed in court his speed could have reached 140 miles an hour. It was 19-year-old John Gribben he was racing that night.
It was on this stretch of road between the Whitlets roundabout and the Homestone that Logan Knox in a Volkswagen Golf, followed by John Gribben in an Audi, were seen overtaking other drivers at speeds of around 100 miles an hour or more. Now, when Logan Knox started to approach the roundabout, he lost control of his car, he hit a van and he spun over onto the other side of the road. And that's where he collided with Joan Price, who was driving north, and killed her.
In my mind, both drivers of both cars were equally responsible for Joan's death. It was a race down a stretch of road no more than a mile long, at speeds of over 100 miles an hour.
Joan Price played trombone in the local Dunaskin Doon brass band. When the crash happened, she'd just left band practice with her friend Gillian Kay. She is still recovering from her injuries, but remembers looking over at Joan and seeing her slumped across the steering wheel. As other motorists on the road that night stopped and ran to help, Logan Knox had jumped into Gribben's car and they left the scene.
The accident was bad enough, so it was very hard to take that someone could do that and then just run away from it afterwards.
Police say what happened that night showed utter contempt for everyone else on this road.
If you're driving at that speed and you're driving in that manner, there's always going to be a high risk that there is going to be an extremely serious incident, and if it wasn't Mrs Price, it could easily have been anyone else using that road.
Logan Knox was jailed for more than 5 years for causing Mrs Price's death by dangerous driving. John Gribben has been on bail since the accident. 2 months after it, he was arrested again for dangerous driving, having crashed while racing. He'll be sentenced for that and causing the death of Mrs Price later this month. The judge said a custodial sentence is highly likely.
I would like to think that the best memorial we can have to Joan's memory is that there are no other drivers, young drivers out there causing death by dangerous driving and putting another family through what I've gone through and the rest of my family over the last year.
Aileen Clark, Reporting Scotland, Glasgow.
The Scottish Football Association is in the midst of one of its most troublesome periods in its long history tonight after the resignation of Chief Executive Stuart Regan. It follows a difficult few weeks for the SFA after the very public failure to fill the national team manager vacancy and doubts over the future of Hampden Stadium as the home of Scottish football. David Curry is there for us now. What happened today then, David?
Well, Sally, we were expecting Stuart Regan to face some tough questions at a board meeting today about those issues you mentioned and one or two others, including the much criticised summer tour for the national team to Peru and Mexico in the coming summer. What we weren't expecting was his resignation. Now, that wasn't expected. However, at a board meeting today, as that meeting progressed, it became apparent that he no longer had the full confidence of the board. As board members left Hampden after what was supposed to be a routine meeting, most of the questions were about the search for a new national team manager.
The board will make a statement on how we're getting on at 4 o'clock, I'm sure.
But that statement, when it came, announced the resignation of the Scottish FA's chief executive. I have devoted my time in Scotland to modernising, protecting, developing and promoting the game, whilst facing into some extremely challenging headwinds during my time in the job. Those headwinds were strong at times, including dealing with the demise of Rangers' old holding company and its controversies. He was also responsible for the recruitment of Gordon Strachan, and after 2 failed qualifying campaigns, the decision to let him go. Regan also presided over the appointment of Malky Mackay as performance director at the Scottish FA. His failure to persuade the Northern Ireland manager Michael O'Neill to take over as Scotland boss left him exposed to major criticism.
I think unfortunately for Stuart, his time at the helm will be looked upon by the majority as being one that slightly negatively, although I think, without wanting to sort of pan Stuart Regan, I think there's things that he's done which are positive. The pyramid system that's been brought into the game is a positive for the teams at the lower end. But the big things, the big decisions and the big topics, I think the fans feel as if things haven't been done right.
It's no real surprise to me. I think over the years he's been under a lot of scrutiny, and there's one thing: the chief executive of the SFA is always going to split opinion, but there's been a number of issues throughout his time in charge, and I think recently the final nail in the coffin for him has been the handling of the Michael O'Neill management position, and of course the summer friendlies as well.
Regan's resignation leaves the SFA in a sort of limbo. No chief executive, no national team manager, and uncertainty about whether the Scottish FA will stay at Hampden or move to Murrayfield.
Well, let's look at that limbo. David, what post do they fill first, manager or chief executive?
Yes, Sally, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? In this case, it could be either. The search for a new chief executive starts immediately, while the search for a new national team manager continues. A subcommittee of the board is looking after that. But bear in mind, the national team have 2 matches coming up at the end of next month, and the Scottish FA will want both posts to be filled by then.
David Curry, thank you very much. A new law has been passed which will extend the definition of domestic abuse beyond physical violence to cover what's described as controlling and coercive behaviour. Some critics claim it could be difficult to gather evidence. Our reporter Lisa Summers has more.
Jen says as her relationship became more intense, so did her partner's controlling behaviour.
I felt like I couldn't do anything right. I felt like I created a set of rules and I was following these rules and it still wasn't good enough. On reflection, there was nothing I could have done because it could have been something else. So the rules that I created would have been: don't say this, don't do that, don't be too loud, Jen, don't be too smart, Jen, don't show off the fact that you're doing all this work, because that made me feel bad. But then actually, if it had not been that, it had been something else.
You can't do anything, hopeless.
It's this sort of conduct, emotional and psychological abuse, that the new legislation is designed to use to secure more prosecutions. Campaigners describe it as groundbreaking.
Women have been telling us for 40 years that it's psychological and emotional abuse that's the most traumatic for them and the hardest to recover from. And yet we have, for such a long time, had absolutely no tools in legislation to take their stories seriously.
This morning, the Lord Advocate met staff at Edinburgh Women's Aid. He says the new laws will give prosecutors more scope.
At present, we tackle domestic abuse where it takes the form of an assault or sexual violence or a particular instance of criminality. What this Act will allow us to do is to recognise that some of the most serious forms of domestic abuse actually take the form of a course of conduct that effectively undermines the victim and causes, or is capable of causing real psychological harm.
Additional money has been made available to train more staff, and 14,000 police officers will also receive additional training. But some lawyers believe there will still be challenges in implementing the law.
I think it will be difficult to secure prosecutions, and I think those who are very keen for the bill recognised it would be difficult. How would you gather sufficient evidence to successfully prosecute in a criminal court? I think there will be problems.
Thank you, Presiding Officer.
This afternoon, the Justice Secretary took to his feet as MSPs debated the bill for a final time.
The result of the vote on motion 10218 in the name of Michael Matheson is yes 118, no 1. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed and the Domestic Abuse Scotland Bill is passed.
The end of one emotional journey. In the coming months, work continues before the law comes into effect. Lisa Summers reporting Scotland, Edinburgh.
Talks have been held at Holyrood this evening in an effort to break the deadlock over the return of EU powers in areas devolved to Scotland. For the first time, the talks involved David Lidington, the new Cabinet Office Minister who took over after Damien Green resigned. For the latest, let's cross to Holyrood and our political editor, Brian Taylor. Brian.
Sally, those talks have just broken up without agreement, without a deal. There wasn't a particular expectation of a deal. The talks were held this evening. John Swinney leading for the Scottish Government, David Lidington, as you mentioned there, leading for the UK Government. UK side described the talks as being constructive, but there is real frustration on the Scottish Government side. At the core here is 111 powers that are currently in areas like agriculture and fisheries, devolved powers that are currently run by the EU. They're to return, of course, after Brexit. The question is, do they return in the first instance to London or do they return to Edinburgh as part of the devolved settlement? I spoke on that topic to David Lidington just as he went into those talks, but first to Mike Russell, who's Scotland's Brexit Minister.
I don't want to stop talking to anybody because we need to make progress, but it is very difficult to have conversations with people who don't bring anything to the table, who go away and say nothing for a long period of time and then come back and repeat the process. You can't have endless meetings about having meetings. There needs to be a decision.
We both want to see the best outcome of Brexit for the whole of the United Kingdom, for every part of Scotland.
Are you ready to change the bill? They say as it stands it's a naked power grab.
I don't think it's that, because what we're about is trying to make sure that the benefits of the UK single market, which is worth, let's not forget, 4 times as much to the people of Scotland as the EU single market, are properly protected.
Now, you heard me there asking David Lidington about the bill. That's the EU withdrawal bill currently before the House of Lords. The contentious clause is clause 11 about the transfer of those powers. It is my understanding that the UK government is ready in principle to back down basically on that clause, to perhaps flip it on its head and turn it round in a way that they believe would satisfy the Scottish Government. Perhaps the contention lies as much within sorting out the UK Government position as it does with the Scottish Government, who are of course required to see the detail of that. But Scottish ministers are just voicing real frustration tonight. They say they don't need more words, they need some action.
Brian Taylor, thank you very much. Alcohol was a factor in more than 3,700 deaths in Scotland in a single year, and the biggest single cause of these was cancer. New NHS findings also show that more than 41,000 people were admitted to hospital as a result of drinking. The figures have prompted new calls for health warnings on labels. Katie Hunter reports.
Andrew Fraser is a recovering alcoholic. He regularly attends support groups in Glasgow. The 39-year-old says his drinking spiralled out of control around 2010.
I couldn't get out of bed unless there was a bottle sitting next to the bed. You don't want to see people, you're ashamed, you think people are staring at you. It's horrible, it really is horrible.
Research from NHS Health Scotland shows drinking contributed to more than 3,700 deaths in 2015, with cancer the single biggest alcohol-related killer.
It shows that the impact that alcohol has on health extends beyond those conditions that we commonly associate with alcohol, such as alcoholic liver disease, extends to conditions such as cancer, strokes and heart attacks.
Researchers also found there were more than 41,000 alcohol-related hospital admissions, with accidental injuries accounting for more than a quarter of that total. The figures have prompted charities to call for better labelling about the risks of alcohol.
It's completely unacceptable that you're required to put more information on a pint of milk than on a bottle of wine. How can we as consumers make informed decisions when we don't know what alcohol products contain and we don't know what the health effects are?
The Scottish Government says it continues to support the implementation of measures which will deliver improved alcohol product labelling. But will clearer labels make any difference?
I just think it'll be a waste of time. I think people who are going to drink to excess will do it regardless of whether there's a label on a bottle or not.
I think there's a lot of kids that don't understand drink as well. You know, kids are saying, you know, they could be 18 plus obviously, but you know, they need to understand the dangers of drinking too much. So I think it's a really good idea, yeah.
I don't think it's going to help because with cigarettes, it's not really helped with cigarettes, has it?
The one thing which helped Andrew was professional support. Without that,
I'd be dead. I know that for a fact. I would be dead if I hadn't reached out and linked in with services like Add Action. I just would be here. Simple as that.
what isn't so simple is changing Scotland's relationship with alcohol and saving lives. Katie Hunter, reporting Scotland, Glasgow.
EU students who start courses at Scottish universities next autumn will still be entitled to free tuition, even though by then Britain is expected to have left the EU. The Scottish Government says its decision will give certainty to universities and sends out a clear signal that EU students continue to be welcome in Scotland. Our education correspondent Jamie McIver is at Glasgow University for us this evening. How significant a decision is this, Jamie?
I think it certainly wasn't an easy decision, Sally. There was a lot to weigh up. Now, EU students are currently entitled to free tuition at Scottish universities under European law, but students from England, Wales and Northern Ireland pay tuition fees. Well, the Scottish Government has now decided to continue with that free tuition for new EU students who start in the autumn of 2019. And that decision has been welcomed by many in education, including the National Union of Students and the principal here at Glasgow University. But many are wanting a debate about what should happen in the longer term. And one argument is that if EU students in the future were to start to pay tuition fees, then even more free places could be available to Scots. And that could potentially help more from disadvantaged backgrounds get a place without making it harder for everyone else. So this debate will certainly continue.
Thanks very much, Jamie McIver there. You're watching BBC Reporting Scotland. It's 14 minutes to 7. A reminder of tonight's top story. A 19-year-old man is found guilty of causing the death of a woman in a crash on the A77 while racing another car. And still to come, Celtic manager Brendan Rodgers defends his captain after claims that players need protection from the midfielder. Fisheries managers on one of Scotland's most important salmon rivers are calling for a sensible debate on whether some birds should be culled to protect fish stocks. They say almost 3/4 of young salmon in the higher reaches of the River Dee are not making it to the sea, largely because they're being eaten. Our environment correspondent Kevin Keane reports.
A toast to the new fishing season. But it's not all going swimmingly for salmon on the River Dee, as mortality rates for young fish are high. Trying to work out why, scientists have tagged and tracked more than 100 on their long journey to the sea. To their surprise, they found that 70% from the higher reaches didn't make it at all. And they're blaming these guys. Goosander, introduced to the UK in the 1870s. They've got quite an appetite.
I think the only explanation can be predation, and the greatest predator in our lower river is goosanders, fish-eating birds.
That's raised questions about the best way to address the conflict.
We know they eat fish, and you know, in nature that's how things work, and there's never normally a problem. But the level of mortality we've seen suggests there may be a sort of an imbalance now, and that is our concern.
It's not just about the birds. 2 years ago, Storm Frank devastated some beets which are still recovering, and there have been attempts to stop the temperature of the water from rising.
What we need to do is to be able to look after the fish. The D's special area conservation for Atlantic salmon and other animals such as otters and freshwater pearl mussels that depend upon them. And we're worried about the status of the fish stocks.
Some goosander are already shot under licence, but that's primarily to scare away the rest. Now they want to propose shooting more. RSPB Scotland questions the conclusions of this report, saying it's pure speculation to link the ducks with the disappearing fish. But they say they welcome a debate on this issue, and that's due to get underway later this week when fishery managers meet Marine Scotland and others. Kevin Keane reporting Scotland on the River Dee.
The Hearts manager Craig Levein says every player should get more protection from the Celtic and Scotland captain Scott Brown. Levein's player Harry Cochrane will miss 2 or 3 matches after a challenge by Brown in a midweek game. But his manager Brendan Rodgers has launched a stout defence, as Caradine Idsan reports.
The moment which annoyed the Hearts manager didn't worry the match referee on Tuesday. Scott Brown's challenge on Harry Cochrane wasn't even deemed a foul. But the 16-year-old is now out for several weeks, and the Tynecastle boss feels there was even premeditation.
After the game at Tynecastle, when Harry bossed him, I think he decided that he wasn't going to let that happen. You know, listen, I know Scott for a long time, and he's aggressive in the way he plays. But I think everybody should get a little bit more protection for Scott Brown, really.
So is Scott Brown a dirty player? His stats would suggest otherwise. He's played 40 matches this season already, picking up 9 yellow cards along the way. He's yet to see red and be sent off, which means his manager naturally has a very different view to his counterpart at Hearts.
You would refute any claims that Scott Brown is overly aggressive or that referees are overly lenient towards him?
Yeah, 100%. I think what he is, he's a top-class international player. And I've been fortunate in my career to have worked with top-level players. And those players are highly competitive and they play on the limit all the time, whether they're midfield players, defenders or strikers. Scott Brown is a great example of a top-class player who plays on the limit every single game.
He's football's version of Marmite, loved by his own fans, not so much by opposing supporters. And he doesn't just lead his club. Scott Brown is still the Scotland captain, having agreed to come back from international retirement under Gordon Strachan. He's only been ordered off twice in 4 years, and this red card at Ross County last season was rescinded. His position as one of the most talked about players in Scottish football isn't likely to change. Caradine Idsan, reporting Scotland.
4 years ago at the Sochi Winter Olympics, Elise Christie missed out on a medal after 3 disqualifications. That was compounded by death threats, which made the Scots speed skater consider quitting. Now she's approaching this month's Olympics in Korea, aiming to right a few wrongs. Alistair Lamont has more.
The bustling city of Seoul, South Korea, home for now to Team GB's short track speed skating team, including the world champion Elise Christie. A trip here in November helped familiarise the athletes with what awaits them this month. Christie is a superstar in a country obsessed with her sport. So obsessed, though, that a collision with one of their own skaters 4 years ago led to online death threats.
When it happens to you, you do believe that that person and those people are genuinely threatening your life and your family's life, and so it becomes very scary. And I think, I spent about 6 months after feeling scared of being in my house on my own or going out on my own, just because so many at once just made it feel so real.
What is real is that a young skater from Livingston has conquered the world.
She was one of these kids you could show her something and she picked it up immediately. In fact, after a few weeks, one of the coaches from the running club asked if she'd like to join, because she saw a lot of potential as a runner there as well. But her heart was in speed skating.
So much so, serious sacrifices had to be made.
When she moved away from home at 15, it was really difficult, I'm not going to lie, and as a parent it's very difficult to let your child go at that age, especially possibly a girl, if I'm being honest. There's days where I have regretted it because I miss her, and obviously, you know, she's always a long distance away.
That remains the case as she seeks to put right what went wrong in Sochi.
To everyone on the exterior, they want to see the redemption. I already personally feel like I've made redemption. The dream isn't to go out and, you know, sit in second place and pick up a medal. The dream is to go out and try and win the gold. And you know what? That might mean we replicate Sochi, but I'm not scared of doing that.
It could be all or nothing again for Christie, but if it's nothing, it won't be for the want of trying. Alistair Lamont reporting Scotland.
And Elise Christie, in from the cold, is on BBC Two on Sunday at 4:45. And Timeline is on BBC Two at 7:30 tonight. Shireen and Glenn can tell us what's coming up.
Tonight, the row about walk-on girls in darts and Formula One. We hear it from both sides.
Find out how social media is helping people with cancer find support.
We'll be joined by Scotland's Young Traditional Musician of the Year.
Plus, the insider stories of some of film's best-loved scores. That's Timeline, 7:30, BBC Two.
In the meantime, the weather. Here's Judith.
Thank you very much, Sally, and a very good evening to you. Things settling down nicely as we approach the end of the working week. Some cracking pictures today from our weather watchers. This one taken from the Isle of Lewis. It looks a wee bit like Little House on the Prairie to me, if you remember that. And some snow covering for one of the ski centres in Loch Harbour, so good news there. As far as tonight's concerned, still those gale force winds in the north and generally in coastal areas, driving in some showers, but any snow confined to the hills. They will ease overnight, as will the winds as well. Generally a lot of dry weather for the rest of the country with long clear spells, a wee touch of frost, but also an ice risk, especially where we've seen those showers today, so be aware of that. Overnight lows typically of around about 2 Celsius, 3 Celsius in our towns and cities, but of course lower in the countryside. So a much better day to come tomorrow. Initially we will see 1 or 2 showers over the Northern Isles, just scraping into the northeast and maybe the eastern borders as well. Elsewhere it's dry, and actually come the afternoon those showers should have died away, and the brisk winds for the Northern Isles and the east coast will have eased as well. So winds will be lighter tomorrow. There'll be more in the way of sunshine really everywhere. It should be a beautiful day, so it will feel better without those strong winds. Sparkling sunshine for the northwest, for the Western Isles, for Skye as well. Maybe a wee bit more in the way of cloud just up towards the Peterhead area, but generally a beautiful day across the country with a ridge of high pressure building in. And as I said, without those winds, it's going to feel a lot different. Now, as we head towards the end of the afternoon and the early evening, nothing really changes. We hold on to the dry weather. There'll be some sunshine. The days are getting longer at last. Some clear spells for a time tonight. Touch of frost in the east, but then the next change, a weather front approaching the west coast during the overnight period, bringing some rain. So here's that front. As it moves inland, it will bang into some cold air, so we could see a wintry mix. So Saturday starts off dry and sunny in the east, but then that weather front with wintry showers within it crosses the country, but it does brighten up behind it in the west. And winds will be lighter, but it will feel quite cold on Saturday as well. Then on Sunday, all that clears away. We're looking at a lot of dry weather. That's your forecast.
Thanks very much, Judith. And that is Reporting Scotland. I'll be back with the headlines at 8 and the late bulletin just after at the 10 o'clock news. Until then, good evening.